Good evening. I'm Terry Thornton, Curator of Education here at the Modern Art Museum of Fort Worth, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to the Fall 2023 season of Tuesday Evenings at the Modern. We have a great lineup running through November 7th with, just to note, a break on Halloween. We won't do Halloween. You can find the schedule on the Modern's website or pick up a card just outside this door. As always, Tuesday evenings is free and open to the public, so I hope you will join us same time, same place throughout the season. Next week, we hear from the artist Jamie Holmes, whose work is currently featured in Jamie Holmes' Make the Revolution Irresistible, which can be found on the museum's first floor galleries. I think most of you have noted that and have visited it. If you get a chance, visit it before next Tuesday, so it will add to the lecture. Tonight is the opening of the Tuesday evening season, but it's also a farewell of sorts for a beloved exhibition, as we are here for what is sure to be a riveting conversation on the work of the erudite and highly prolific abstract expressionist Robert Motherwell in conjunction with Robert Motherwell Pure Painting, organized by guest curator Susan Davidson, as well as an invitation or maybe a prompt to go back into the galleries this week to revisit the exhibition currently filling the second floor galleries before it closes this coming Sunday. So you've been given the word. You have until Sunday. And here, I would like to also note and express our deep appreciation of the Daedalus Foundation for their generous support of tonight's program. For tonight, Susan Davidson is here with art historian and curator Catherine Kraft and programs director and director of the Robert Motherwell Catalog Resonate Project of the Daedalus Foundation, Katy Rogers. Katy has graciously agreed to join Susan and Catherine in artist Carrie Moyer's absence. Unfortunately, Carrie can't be here due to a flight cancellation resulting from storms in New York. And as we know, you can't fight with Mother Nature. So, however, Susan, Catherine, and Katy each have a significant and unique relationship with Motherwell's work and all that surrounds it, so we are all in very good hands. Susan Davidson is an authority in the field of surrealism, abstract expressionism, and pop art, with a specialty in the art of Robert Rauschenberg. She is also an accomplished museum professional with over 30 years of experience at two distinguished institutions, the Menil Collection in Houston and the Solomon R. Guggenheim Museum in New York. In addition to organizing Robert Motherwell Pure Painting, Susan Davidson is currently writing a monograph on Tom Wesselman's Great American Nudes and is the Volume 1 editor of Rauschenberg's Catalog Resonate. Catherine Kraft is curator at the Nasher Sculpture Center here in Dallas and a scholar of Dada, Abstract Expressionism, and Neo-Dada. She was the curator of the traveling exhibitions, The Nature of Art in 2018, and Melvin Edwards' 5 Decades in 2015, as well as Carol Beauvais, Collage Sculptures 2021, and Neri Bagarama, I always had trouble with her name, Bagaramian, Medel Vivant 2022. She holds a doctoral degree from the University of Texas at Austin and is the author of numerous articles and books, including As Audience of Artists, Dada, Neo-Dada, and the Emergence of Abstract Expressionism with University of Chicago Press 2012 and Robert Rauschenberg, Feiden Book 2013. Katy Rogers, as mentioned, is the programs director and director of the Robert Motherwell Catalog Resonate Project at the Daedalus Foundation. She is the author of the Catalog Resonate of Motherwell's drawings, published by Yale University Press in November 2022, and a co-author of the catalog raisonné of Motherwell's paintings and collages, published by Yale University Press in 2012, and of Motherwell 100 Years, published by Skira in 2015. Katy currently serves on the boards of the College Art Association and the Daedalus Foundation, and is a member of the National Advisory Board of the Laundromat Project. I'm afraid this is a brief introduction of each of our accomplished guests tonight, but I want to allow time for amazing insights on Robert Motherwell and his work for you to take back into the galleries this coming week, before the exhibition becomes a memory. Susan Davidson will begin tonight by laying out the exhibition before she joins Catherine Kraft and Katie Rogers in an enlightened conversation. So now, if you would, join me with a warm welcome for our guest.
Hello, everyone. Delighted to see some familiar faces and happy to be back in Fort Worth, a city I've come to know over the last few years of working on this exhibition. So I'm just going to quickly run you through the organization of the exhibition, and then we will sit together and talk. I'm sorry that Carrie Moore didn't make it, but I hope that you won't be disappointed in some of the insights that the three of us can share on Motherwell. As Terry mentioned, I'm the guest curator of Robert Motherwell Pure Painting, and my association with Motherwell dates back to 2012, when I organized an exhibition devoted to the artist's first decade of his collage making. By contrast, the Modern's association with the artist is substantially longer and is deeply rooted with the artist's varied career, holding over 70 works in all media. Most significantly, the Modern hosted the artist's last full-scale retrospective in 1991, just as your director, Dr. Marla Price, was taking the helm here. Given this institutional commitment, Dr. Price was keen to contextualize the museum's remarkable holdings. In search of a curator familiar with the artist, she approached the Daedalus Foundation, who, as Terry mentioned, steward the artist's legacy, for suggestions, and thus the marriage began. I'm immensely grateful to both of the Daedalus and to Dr. Price for the trust they placed in me. As I delved into the long achievements and career in Motherwell's catalog raisonnés, I began to understand that a paintings retrospective was long overdue, and that is why the exhibition only features paintings and nothing more. Although I think that in 53 works we see quite a bit of remarkable achievement for him. Often seen as a founding member of the New York School, a term that Motherwell coined in 1950, he forged a unique path, one that traveled between the tenets of European modernism and a profound and intellectual form of expressionism that became his hallmark. He invested his abstract paintings with an expansive consciousness of historical traumas and injustices that the physical act of his art making, rendering his practice especially relevant for audiences today. The exhibition is essentially presented chronologically on the second floor of this amazing Tadeo Ando building, which itself is so well suited for paintings of this scale and dynamism. As one ascends the top of the staircase, you are immediately encounter the two tenets that Motherwell focused on throughout his 50-year career, which is figuration and abstraction. The artist moved to New York in 1940 to study art history at Columbia University after graduating with undergraduate degree in philosophy from Stanford and graduate work at Harvard. However, a series of social introductions quickly led him to abandon academia to pursue a career as an artist. A formative trip to Mexico in 1941 with Chilean surrealist Roberto Mata set the path for the next few years as Motherwell vacillated between an American-style sense of surrealism and figuration while searching for his artistic vocabulary, examples of which are in the first gallery of the exhibition. A hint of how his work would develop is seen in a particular work against the back wall called The Voyage from 1948 that would soon be realized in Motherwell's most famous series, The Elegies to the Spanish Republic, that he begins in 48 and continues until his death in 1991. Motherwell viewed his elegy paintings, the titles of which reference the atrocities of the Spanish Civil War from 1936 to 39, as a metaphor for all injustice. The large black ovoid form set against white grounds represented for the artist a majestic commemoration of human suffering that signified abstract poetic symbols for the inexplorable cycle of life and death. Although Motherwell created over 150 paintings over the arc of his career, for this series, the exhibition shows just 6 examples that correspond to the decades in which they are made, and thus demonstrating the development of the series itself. It was extremely important to me as a curator not to provide everybody with one big impact, but to pepper it across the career. I also think that it was important to see how the elegies relate to how the artist is working on other series at the same time, so that you really understand his approach to painting in a much more clear way that hasn't been seen in a long time. Examples of important series created in the 1950s and 1960s populate the next 3 galleries of the exhibition. As he matured as an artist, we experienced the confidence of his brush, the definition of his palette, and some of his most emotionally revealing artworks. For example, the Je t'aime paintings, created between 1955 and 57, bear declarations of love boldly written across their surfaces, characterizing the artist's desire to love at a time his second marriage was dissolving. Artistic camaraderie was found with fellow artist Helen Frankenthaler, who became his 3rd wife in 1958. Separate but equal artists, their travels frequently informed Motherwell's creative output. The Iberia series, which is seen in the 2nd gallery, where it's directly inspired by a bullfight the 2 artists attended on their European honeymoon. The stark black canvases with their thin, stain-like ochre forms evoke the presence of a bull, or of the bull, who ultimately dies. Beginning in the summer of 1960, Motherwell and Frankenthaler rented a villa on Italy's Ligurian coast. Inspired by the environs, he created the first works of his Summertime in Italy series. Their compositional format, color scheme, and abstracted sense of light, featured in a number of paintings on paper and large canvases, occupied him throughout the 1960s. From the window of his Provincetown, Massachusetts studio, Motherwell often observed the waves crashing against the sea that begot the Caprice paintings. The single spray of water depicted in those works was created by spontaneously flinging paint from his brush and embodies an automatism practice that Motherwell first experimented with in the 1940s. By 1967, the artist had seen enough minimalist art, which was then the vogue mostly in New York and to some lesser degree in California on the West Coast, that he began to embrace a sparser approach to his canvases. A chance encounter in his studio, a smaller painting leaning against another, larger one, led him to trace an outline onto the canvas, which he imagined as a door. He then reoriented the larger canvas so that the open end of a rectangular of the U shape was at the top, now recalling an open window. Thus, the opens, the largest and most reductive series within Motherwell's oeuvre, developed from what he deemed a continual problem in painting. Typically executed in a monochrome palette of either blue, ochre, or white, with occasional use of green, red, and black, the opens demonstrate the artist's preoccupation with creating large fields of color, full of rich but restrained painterly incident and with a minimum of freehand drawing. He produced over 200 related pictures over approximately a 5-year period, and key examples are included in the exhibition's penultimate gallery. Though not as art-typical as Motherwell's Elegy and Open series, the emotionally charged forms in the Hollow Men series, examples of which conclude the exhibition, became the last major imagery in Motherwell's painting repertoire. The meandering, curvilinear ensemble of loosely drawn forms on ochre grounds are linked in a surprisingly representational way, almost like figures holding hands. And as is often the case with an artist, they will somewhat go back to their beginnings. So as figuration was a great interest to Motherwell at the start of his career, he kind of, in a more abstracted way, comes back to it at the end of his career. He himself singled out the series as being among the most realized works of my career. He also noted that they included various submerged and indirect references to other elements outside the pictures themselves, what the artist had earlier called after images. So Motherwell's process, which is one of the things that we're going to talk about among ourselves this evening and open it up then to questions from the audience, he applied this amazing paint, layers of paint, opaque paint, with in textured layers that reproductions don't at all give you the opportunity to understand. So I really encourage you all to spend time in the exhibition and to understand the brushwork and the significance of how he applies that with such confidence and bravura, and really, in a way, brings you into his physical act of his own art making. My hope in organizing the exhibition is that it and its catalog would elicit a new understanding of Motherwell's work, of the dense and layered surfaces of those paintings, and that would confirm his stature as one of America's most important post-war painters. He was an intensely intellectual painter, which initiated a lifelong impulse to rework and thereby rethink his painted oeuvre. And I think that's one of the sub-themes of the exhibition, and it's also a play on the exhibition's title. And I think it's something that we, among ourselves, are going to talk about this evening. So Katy and Kathy, if you join me, we will start our conversation.
One place that might be kind of interesting to start was to begin with this idea of reworking images, because as we see in the paintings that are cycling through, Motherwell often returned to work sometimes years after paintings had left the studio and been exhibited, and came back, and often there is the evidence of underlayers of paint are visible. And so, Susan, Katy, I wonder if you would want to talk about.
Yeah, I'll just start if I may. I have to say, for me, that was a huge surprise. I had been looking at Motherwell's work for a long time, but I had no sense that there was different compositions often underneath. Now, as an art historian, you can ultimately train your eye to see when there's a painting underneath, but he has covered over them in such a remarkably mannered way that it was quite shocking for me, and I wanted to kind of bring that forward in the exhibition and in the catalog. And I think, Katy, you have even recently told me that you, as you all were doing the catalog Resonate work, well, that was a big discovery for you too, because he hadn't left notes about all of this.
It's very true. So the catalog Resonate gathers all of the artworks together, and you might have noticed when you're in the gallery that some of the labels have very complicated dates. So those come from the catalog Resonate research. And we started with Motherwell's own collection of papers. That included about 30,000 images. And within that were exhibition images and images of artworks in early states. And over time, we were able to build up a real understanding of what we've come to describe as the tension between instinct and intellect in Motherwell's painting. So he's, of course, a member of the abstract expressionist generation, which is often described as, acting on the canvas, the action painters. So you have your immediate automatic impulse, but Motherwell would go back and refine that over time. And I think Susan really picked some incredible paintings that show you what he's doing very plainly. And I think that's very unique, and he was very aware of that being an important part of his process.
Well, I think one thing that also strikes me about these paintings that, particularly in the exhibition, is that often the sort of signs or indications of earlier states of the painting are visible. I mean, they're very purposely left visible, and they might just come in the tiniest of bits, like a little flash of blue running along what is otherwise a black mass of paint, or we've talked about this, what one can only call a haloing effect, which if you paint with oil on paper, the oil is going to seep through and halo the forms. Motherwell also seems to do something like this in paintings where there's not actually a halo that's occurring. He's sort of drawing or painting one around these forms. And I think it's really interesting that he leaves not only sort of brushstroke visible, but signs of this. Its signs of the revision are visible, but it doesn't create like a narrative. Like you're saying, you don't necessarily see through to what the earlier state of the painting was.
No, you read the painting as a whole. You don't see it segmented or in sections.
Do you have a sense of why he worked like that?
I think Katy would have to answer that. I mean, I did not have the opportunity to meet the artist, so I didn't get to ask that question. But
I think a lot of people wish they had asked him that question now, because I think it is very unique to his practice. Because as you said, they're there and they're visible, these reworkings, and yet they're also obfuscated. And Motherwell himself wrote about it at different times, where he talked about with the Fishes with Red Stripe that it contains in equal measure that spontaneous action and the correction. And he was trained in philosophy, and he talks about how he felt like that set him up well to be an abstract artist, understanding philosophically that everything you experience is an abstraction. What is reality? What is our concrete experience of the world? And I think his paintings challenge us to understand that. You brought up the idea of after image, that there are many layers to our experience, as well as many layers of the painting, whether or not we see them or understand them. There is that sort of emotional as well as intellectual aura to the objects.
I mean, if we think about the first room of the show, which contains Motherwell's earliest works, I think one thing that's intriguing about that, I mean, Motherwell was also a really eloquent writer. He's expressed himself verbally on a level that, I mean, I certainly admire and wish I could as well. But he wrote a lot about his work, and in these early years when he's just beginning to form as an artist. And some of the paintings in that first room, you will see areas, Recuerdo de Coyoacán, which is cycling through in the PowerPoint, has a little rectangular area with spatters of paint. And what Motherwell claimed was that all these paintings started as sort of automatic painting or drawing, but it seemed so disorderly that he ultimately, overlaid what was often a geometric composition on top of it, and that little window was all the disorder he could stand in the painting. So there is this kind of, almost two-step process built in from the beginning that seems to have come out of a lack of, certainty or aversion to losing control. But then he seems to find a way to make it into a really viable way of working. I mean, what I think in other artists would be judged as perhaps a shortcoming or an indecisiveness in his work, I think goes in very interesting directions.
It's interesting to me that as he starts as an artist, he's very involved with a lot of the European surrealists who are exiled in New York during the Second World War, and of course, they are practicing surrealism and automatist techniques, which, as you quite rightly say, Motherwell mimics, but the sense of order that comes from his academic leanings in education really take over. And I think that is that weird tension that always exists in the work. And you particularly see it in the work of the early 40s. By the 50s and 60s, he's much more confident and has moved away from it, but there's still these moments when he kind of lets loose, for lack of a better word, and is a lot more free in his paint application and such. For me, Motherwell is a super interesting artist in that regard because he doesn't really fit into any category of what is going on in the New York art world during that, from the 40s through to the end of his career. I mean, he's 10 years younger than all the abstract expressionist artists that he's associated with and who he champions. He's much older, much younger than all the surrealists, and yet he lived longer all the way through, what was going on into the 80s with, again, with figurative work. And he was always very engaged with the artist of his time, but he stuck very much to his own structure in his practice, which I think is so fascinating.
I think that, he's often synthesizing things as a very analytical thinker. He's taking philosophical concepts, but he's also looking at art history. He's very serious about understanding modern art. The Daedalus Foundation was created to understand and to further the understanding and appreciation of modern art. So this is something that is a through line from the very beginning. And so it is the dynamism of being in the studio, which Motherwell felt connected to what he called his own atavism. So he felt it was a very primal act, but he was also a very analytical thinker.
Did he work mostly at night?
He did work mostly at night. Part of that was because he was an asthma sufferer.
Why would that make you work at night?
He talks about his childhood and being awake at night, feeling like he was suffocating. And so sort of having a fear of death during the evening. And he talks about that in his life, that his whole life he's been obsessed with the idea of death and how that also is a part of the subjects he chooses and the paintings he creates.
And it seems like, I think also that it has something to do with the palette of the work and the prevalence of Black. There's a wonderful essay that he wrote called Black or White, in which he talks about black and white as part of his work, and he talks about the black pigment coming from the bones of animals, like charcoal and being ground up, and that kind of depth.
Absolutely. Black and white are definitely the protagonists, but we were talking, and you and I have discussed as well, the color that's in even the earliest paintings. But if you look at even the black and white paintings, one of the very first elegies started out as a small drawing, but one of the first paintings, which is quite small, if you look very closely, there is a light blue paint underneath all of the black forms. They really reward a lot of close looking, that if you think something from a distance has that sort of graphic cohesiveness, he challenges that when you start to look more closely.
I think the palette of the colors, the blues, the ochres, really come more from his Western upbringing, which having spent most of his life in New York and then outside of New York and Connecticut, the light is quite different. And yet it's something that very much materializes, particularly in the printed and collage works, more so than in the painted works, I think. But it is true that black and white are the dominant. And of course, there are many other artists who work in monochromatic paint schemas like that, Soulage, Franz Klein. I'm sure there are many, many others, but they were contemporaries of Motherwell. But I think Motherwell always brought this very strong intellectual inquisitiveness to the work that he was making in the studio.
I think related also to the question of color, Katy and I were talking about the moment, there's a moment in the 60s when he begins to shift away from oil paint to acrylic, and the kinds of effects, why he did that and the kind of effects that it had on his work. I mean, Katy, do you want to speak a little more to that?
Sure. Oil paint has a number of qualities that Motherwell felt sort of resisted what he was aiming for. He never fully gave up oil paint. We were discussing that a bit, but it takes a long time to dry, and if you're reworking something, that can also be complicated because it picks up the lower layers. Oil paint can also have a bit of a sheen to it, and Motherwell really wanted the sort of matte blacks. And we were talking about this a little bit in the galleries earlier, that you see a lot of the brush strokes in these paintings when you're there, but they are still very cohesive. And you mentioned this, how they're really difficult to reproduce. Because if you see the brush strokes, that's all you see. But if you remove them, it's just a flat field, which is not how the paintings are in person.
And they take on a very graphic quality at that point, which if Carrie were here, she would be talking to us about that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's one of the things that she and other painters as well, and I are really fascinated by this tension in Motherwell's work between this very rich and complex surface and what in reproduction or from a distance also reads in a very graphic way. And in fact, I think, for example, there are a number of works in the exhibition, The Voyage 10 Years After, for example, that look incredibly contemporary. I mean, they look like a kind of mixing of different painterly languages that could have been made in the last year.
I think that was very important for me to bring examples like that picture and others, the New York Elegy, etc., to show people how current Motherwell is, even though he's been dead for 40-odd years, sadly.
Part of the audience for a catalog raisonné is artists. And I've spoken to a number of artists who have looked at it, and the highest praise has been that it makes me want to go back to my studio and paint. And I think there is something there. We talked a bit about sort of his courage to continue to innovate within his series of motifs and be open to that throughout his life. And part of that, he was extremely prolific. Part of that was he did not define himself or limit himself to painting, but he was a very important collagist. His drawings are really, really incredible. The Menil hosted a drawing exhibition last year. I recommend the catalog. But also his printmaking, and we talked a bit about that too. He had his own press from the 70s until the end of his life, and that sense of seriality was really important, and it transferred into the printmaking, but also the idea of modification. With a print, you can run a color through, and then if you don't like it, you can remove that. So it gave him the freedom to try out different things without having to commit to them.
And do we know that one day, like on a Thursday, he painted, and on Wednesday he made collages, or was it all happening simultaneously?
It's a great question. He built a studio complex in Greenwich, Connecticut, and he had a series of interlocking studios over which he had a small living space. And he would talk about moving between the studios. So if he came up against a particularly thorny painting problem, he'd move to the collage studio until his work there would then help him resolve the painting. And I think that's really interesting. All of his work is of a piece. So when you look at I think there's a studio image. There it is. Oh, great timing. You can see he always has his work together. He would talk about these things being seed works. And so the same motifs get picked up sometimes decades later. He also would pin up reproductions of his own work as well as other artists' work. And many of the later works in the show stem from earlier paintings or works on paper.
I don't know of another artist who had such an equal career across these various media. I think that's most unusual about Motherwell's practice.
Yeah, and I think also one of the things I've been thinking about as we're seeing the images and talking about the way he's moving between different media and also different modes of working within a painting is how important collage was to him as in his early years and also throughout his life, because I was having deja vu when you were talking about, acrylic versus oil and how slowly oil paint dries by comparison. And one of the reasons he took up or became involved with collage as much as he did in the 40s was as an alternative to wanting to work more quickly, but not being able to do that in painting. But I feel like it's really interesting to see, usually when you see Motherwell, you do see paintings in the context of collage. And it's nice to see just paintings. And in a way, though, to see how thoroughly, to me at least, Motherwell still has a kind of collage, mentality or way of thinking when he's painting.
No, I agree. I mean, I think the way he organizes his forms is very much from that kind of cut and paste aspect that he started with the collage. I mean, having done an exhibition on his early collages, I always felt that the paintings come directly from those. And if I had had my druthers and if there'd been more space and more time, I probably would have included some of the early collages in order to really support how he develops as a painter, because I think that that's an incredibly important aspect of the work. By the 60s and 70s, when he's working in collage and doing drawings, all of which relate to the series that he's doing, there's a uniformity of it. It's not as creative, in my feeling. So that's another reason why I did not want to do a full-scale retrospective of every bit of the media. It would have choked us all at the end of the day. And that's the great thing about being a curator and working with an artist as brilliant and prolific as Motherwell is that you make choices, just in the way that he made choices about how he repainted or organized his canvases, et cetera.
With what you were just saying, you see how important, say, collage was to his paintings of the 40s. Are there other periods of his career where, other practices like, drawing or printmaking also feed back into the painting in that strong a degree?
Speak to that best,
I do. I feel like it's very hard to pick one thread out from Motherwell. They're so interconnected, both in his practice and his thinking and approach. But one example that we were talking about earlier, and you mentioned the Hollow Men series. So Motherwell was engaged by the National Gallery of Art to create a mural for their new building in the 70s. It's a reconciliation elegy, and if you go to Washington, you can see it hanging there. And he did not work by creating traditional studies. Usually he would start with a lot of automatic drawing. So he was thinking about, they wanted an elegy, and he was working on these very sort of sketchy forms, not these clearly defined, filled-in forms. And so one of the earliest drawings of that was a study for reconciliation elegy, the National Gallery painting, but later, he retroactively renamed it Hollow Men, 10 years later after he created the Hollow Men series. So that drawing, which is on Mylar, which is also really fascinating because it has a certain transparency to it. So it has a slickness, a dimensionality to it. He had some gouache on it that sort of sits on the surface there. And those sort of sketchy, drawn figural things show up towards the end of his life as well. And drawing is so important to those paintings, and the drawn line. I was really thinking about that today. It's front and center, even though it's an enormous room-size painting.
Big or small? Yeah.
Yeah, and it's also nice to see drawing. We were seeing areas where drawing with charcoal comes into the paintings as well. I mean, I guess the opens most marketable.
Yes, but in the opens, they're very structured. So it doesn't have that free form of hand. I mean, you do see that the line isn't straight per se, but it's not lyrical in any way. Whereas I think the drawings, and
that's true,
it's very much that way.
I mean, the other thing that strikes me thinking about the paintings, and also when we were just circling back to collage for just a moment, other artists of Motherwell's generation also, were known to change, their paintings or work on them for a very long time. I mean, like Gorky, de Kooning. But this was something I think I was asking you, Katy, that Motherwell, when he changed work, he always just covered it. He didn't, like Gorky would scrape down and sand and start again, or de Kooning would do transfers, or there were often these sort of jump cuts. And I feel like, though, with Motherwell, there's a sense of layers. There may be things that are obscured, but you also get a sense of, I don't know, a temporal sense that it's all still there, even if some of it is covered up.
I like that idea of temporality. I mean, I think for Motherwell, the act of painting, but the act of being in front of a painting is experiential. You experience the making of it as well, which I think is very visible when you start to look at the surfaces of the paintings.
Yeah, I mean, I've been given an indication of how much time we have or don't have. We can take a few questions, or we can first see, is there, Susan or Katy, is there anything else you'd
I'd love
like
to hear from the audience if they have some questions.
Okay, and what we'll do, since we're recording this, if you ask, I think we can hear you without a mic, but I may try to repeat the question, so yeah, right there.
Thank you so much for this insightful conversation. It's inspiring hearing from intellectual female art historians. Thank you, Terry, for organizing such an engaging series, and congratulations. So I have a couple of questions. In the catalog, Motherwell talks about using blue warmly. And then at the end of this quote, he's like, even black I use warmly. And then just now in this discussion, one of you mentioned this obsession with depth. And I'm wondering, despite this abundance of black pigment, obsession with death, this Warnley statement sounds, it sounds optimistic. I'm wondering if you feel like Robert Motherwell was an optimistic artist, person. My second question is, I really don't know much about his relationship and admiration for Charles Baudelaire. One of you guys could explain a little bit of that. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Okay, I'll try to just recap so we have it. It's a two-part question. The first part is about the colors blue and black, and Motherwell talking about using them warmly, and yet black having this association with death for him, and what that says about his, I guess, emotional attitude toward that color. And the second question was about his relationship to Charles Baudelaire. So.
All right. I'll try. About the sense of warmness and optimism in his paintings. He was, as you mentioned, born in California, and he talks a lot about light and about that sense of Mediterranean light as well, sort of that clear, warm light that of the blues of the sun being on sort of the ochre ground and the ocean. He had a long-time summertime studio in Provincetown, Massachusetts on Cape Cod, and he would often talk about that also having Mediterranean light. But I think in terms of that warmness, I think he talked about the medium of paint being the closest thing we as human beings have to our emotional life. That paint could express human feeling and emotion better than anything else, better than written word or film or any other medium. This was his own personal take on it, but he was deeply invested in the aesthetic, but also we were talking about this, the ethical component of his paintings as being a humanistic practice. So if there's a warmth in the colors, I think it comes from a lot of layers again, that sense of atavism, that sense of being a part of a history and an earth, his materials coming from the earth, but also his experience as a human being within the world, and wanting to connect to other human beings through his painting and his medium. Does anyone else want to talk about Baudelaire? Or
Actually, in one of the pictures that have cycled through of him early in his studio, you see an image of Baudelaire in the studio. It'll probably come around, but I think Motherwell was deeply involved and engaged with reading and thinking about a lot of poets, French, Irish, James Joyce being one in particular. He was fiercely committed to reading poetry and literature, but I cannot tell you specifics. I think Katy can.
And I think Susan's done an amazing job in the galleries of highlighting the literary aspect of the painting. So The Homely Protestant is a title that comes from James Joyce through the surrealist activity of opening up your book, your favorite book, and putting your finger down, and that phrase was the title of your work. And also The Hollow Men comes from T.S. Eliot. There are many layers of literary references. But we have also talked about this in front of the paintings. You don't have to have those references to respond to the painting, although he did place them there. And he never titled a work before he began it. It was always after the fact.
I think that's true of most artists. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Because otherwise you'd know where you were going.
That's true. That's true.
I can jump on with one more thing about Baudelaire, perhaps, which is that French culture was very important to Motherwell. And when in the 40s in New York in particular, as he got to know some of the surrealist artists who were in New York, who had fled Europe because of the war, Baudelaire was a sort of singularly important poet figure to people like André Breton. He was seen as being kind of the modern poet. And, that's, I think, something that Motherwell also very strongly identified with. The Voyage is named after a poem by Baudelaire, which is about setting out to unknown lands, which I think Motherwell very much saw as a metaphor for his own practice. All right, here.
First off, kudos on a fantastic show. I think today is the best museum look in its history. With the Motherwell show and the gifts from Anne Marion, it looks fantastic.
She was generous.
Right. So I have two questions. One for the curator. The museum has a huge collection of Motherwells. It's a fantastic show. And they have a huge elegy, I think the second to the last elegy, and a beautiful summer open, and a nice little elegy gem. Why aren't those shown?
Practical reasons, as always, which sadly becomes part of a curator's remit. The large elegy was sort of too big and too overwhelming for the scale of the other pictures that were being shown. And also I was saving it so that it could go to Vienna, which is where the exhibition travels to next. In terms of the Blue Mediterranean Open, which is a terrific painting, it was in the galleries, intended to be included, and a painting that I wasn't expecting came through at the last minute, and it ended up taking its place. And sometimes it's very hard to not show a loan that you've taken, and easier to return something to storage. As much as it breaks your heart, and as important as it would have been to have that blue open in the room, it just, it was gonna be too crowded. So those are the kind of practical factors that curators face when they're installing a show.
One more question, I think, for Katy. Can you speak a little bit on the Iberia series? I've read a lot on Motherwell, and there's very little written about that.
Sure. The question is about Motherwell's Iberia series. So Motherwell, as Susan mentioned before, was very much engaged with the Spanish Civil War and the feelings around that. When he was at Harvard, one of his professors, they were talking about, what can one do in the late 30s when some atrocity like this is happening in the world? And his philosophy professor at that time said, what you can do instead of going there and fighting on the front lines is to live a life of freedom and expression that fights against fascism. And I think he carried that seed with him for his entire life, but he did not make it to Spain until his honeymoon with Frankenthaler in 1958. And they spent some time there. They sort of got kicked out of Spain, which is a longer story, which I think is maybe told in the catalog. But they did see some bullfights there. And so he's there, he's on a honeymoon with someone who will be an absolutely integral part of his artistic practice, but his social life for the coming decade of their marriage. They traveled an enormous amount and were a part of a very interesting milieu in New York and Europe. But this is the very beginning. During that trip, he also starts a series called The Frontier Paintings. And he says, after these years, Susan alluded to, of his difficult second marriage, he crossed a frontier when he was in Spain into this incredible moment in his life of productivity. So the Iberia series are essentially, they went to the bullfight, and the Spanish bulls, as he describes them, are these small, very coal black, very, very dark, and the contrast of the bull and the ochre sand of the ring. And essentially, the earliest ones are sort of a zoom in of the underside of the bull and the ring underneath. And he talks about how emotional it was to watch the bullfight. So beautiful, but also emotional to see that aspect of that culture. So the Iberia series are rooted in that, but again, you can feel the power of these without necessarily knowing of that context for him. I recommend reading the Catalogue Raisonné essays. There's more about it there.
There was somebody in the back, I think, has had their hand up for a while. Oh, okay. First you behind. Yes, with your hand still up. Yes. And then you, back in the left corner.
Gratitude for the foresight. How did the modern become such a center for Motherwell's work? Was it the gift of a particular donor? Was it an interest or a foresight that he would become who he became? Yeah. It's just a bit odd that Fort Worth has such.
Well, they have probably one of the most outstanding collections of Motherwell, after the Museum of Modern Art in Denver also has quite a number, but not to the extent that is here. But it has to do with, first with E.A. Carmine, and then with Marla Price when she came here, because that retrospect, she met Motherwell just before the artist died. And then with the foundation, which often happens with an artist after their death, the foundation will institute what they call a gift purchase program, where they will offer to institutions set paintings at a reduced price. So it's half gift, half purchase. And Marla went to see what the foundation had chosen for her to consider, and she said, "I'll take all of them." Which I think surprised Jack Flam, who is still the executive director of the foundation. And that then there was a second opportunity about 10 years later, where she was able to fill in certain gaps. So really it's really due to her foresight and commitment to the artist that has created this remarkable trove of material. And it really became the foundation for which the exhibition was centered around.
Absolutely, and for Motherwell himself, he expressed to his board of directors prior to his death that he wanted groupings of works to go to institutions, so that was a priority for the foundation, that if an institution would take on large groupings because of the diversity in his body of work, then they would find a way to work with them. So it was kind of a marriage.
I mean, despite the fact that this practice still continues today as artists pass away and foundations are established, institutions don't really have the financial and the physical commitment to take large bodies of work at once. So the shift is happening in that regard, I think.
And yes, you in the back.
Yeah, thank you for all of your great insights. It's a challenging exhibition for a non-artist, so thank you for helping us understand this better. This is, I think, a simpler question than the others, I think. I was wondering, I always tend to ask artists, even though I'm not an artist, is there any artist that inspires you or that you admire, particularly your contemporaries? I heard your comments about the surrealists. I know there's a David Smith thing that someone gave to David Smith. There's a tribute to Mark Rothko up there. Did you find any references in your great research of people, probably contemporaries? I'm more interested in contemporaries of this, because his work is so different than his contemporaries, in my opinion, actually. And I'm just curious whether there's anything, any other than David Smith and Rothko, who are upstairs, their paintings are upstairs. Is there anyone else that you said, wow, that guy, I really wish that guy's work I really like?
Not sure I can answer that question.
No. Well, I mean, he did love Matisse. Matisse as a colorist, and the figural forms as well. And he did, in terms of his contemporaries, he had a social and intellectual engagement with many of the artists. Newman, Rothko,
Even Pollock.
yeah, and So he was very much engaged in that. He does talk about Franz Klein, them talking about the use of black and white during that period.
They taught together in 51 at Black Mountain College, right?
That's right. That's right. And Motherwell also was a very early supporter of Cy Twombly. He wrote the essay for Twombly's first solo show, and wrote letters of recommendation that went on to win Twombly travel grants that then created his career. So he was also a teacher at Hunter College, and impacted a lot of younger artists and hired a lot of his contemporaries, including Ad Reinhardt and William Basiotes there.
Thank you. Very interesting.
Yeah, and just
Yes.
yeah,
You can't forget her.
Yeah, and just to add to the Hunter College remark, one of the things that Carrie told me really made an impression on her as a young student and young artist about Motherwell is that he had taught at Hunter and taught women, that his students there were women.
That's right. Hunter, he taught there from 50 to right after his marriage with Frankenthaler, and it was a women's college then, and he was mostly teaching teachers. So then they would take their learnings back to their classrooms and pass them on. And he really was one of the first people who brought in practicing modern contemporary artists into graduate programs, and what he did there really rippled out to our current understanding of Masters of Fine Arts programs.
Very helpful. Thank you.
I think that's time, but if there's one more you want to take, there's something.
There was someone more.
Yes, one more.
What was his indebtedness to Whitehead and process metaphysics?
I can't answer that.
As a non-philosophy major, I'll try. So he did study at Harvard. So his undergraduate at Stanford more focused on literature, and his father didn't want him to be an artist, so he said, if you can go get your PhD and become a teacher, that will be a practical thing that can support you. So he went to get a philosophy PhD, a very practical degree, in the late 30s. But he studied there with pragmatist philosophers, and he was very influenced by Arthur Lovejoy and Whitehead, as you note, but also Prowl, and thinking about the concept of art as experience influenced his understanding of his own painting, and he also would he would take specific philosophical constructs, and he talks about it. It's interesting. He was going to write his dissertation there on Delacroix. So not a philosopher, but he was looking at Delacroix's journals, which is why he traveled to Paris in the year 38, 39, because he liked the idea of Delacroix as an artist and an intellectual, rather than the artist as like a feeling beast, is what he said. But he talks later about, he never finished his dissertation. He said it got torpedoed on the boat back. We've never been able to actually verify that any version of his dissertation existed, or that something was torpedoed at that time. But he talked about, he loved the idea of the artist as someone with ideas just roiling in their head and constantly thinking, and that, again, that analytical and the emotional. There are some very interesting dissertations about Motherwell's relationship to pragmatist philosophy. If you're interested in them, there is a professor named Gregory Gilbert who focused on that, and you can read his dissertation that goes into that in depth.
It wasn't torpedoed.
I doubt it was torpedoed or maybe ever existed. It could have been metaphorically torpedoed. While he was there, he rented a studio in Paris, and he painted mostly. So, and he did amass an incredible library of books on Delacroix, and he saw an exhibition of Delacroix's work. So he did some academic work, but it was really, he really wanted to spend time with the artists, and he saw Picasso making collages on a table in Paris.
Okay, I guess that seems like a good place to bring the evening to an end. So, thank you.